Welcome to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Triangle BR03 bookshelf speakers. So let's get started. So I've been interested in the BR03s ever since they were first reviewed on Zero Fidelity a few years ago. But every time I go to purchase a pair, they would be back ordered or out of stock at the US online distributor, which is Adorama. So when I got a stock notification earlier this year that they had come back into stock in the color I was interested in, this USA edition oak green, I went ahead and picked up a pair, and I've been using them for the last few months. So as of the making of this video, they are currently back ordered at Adorama with an estimated date of December 2024. But I'd say that if you're interested in these, definitely sign up for one of those notifications, and they do get them back in stock consistently. So I would consider these to be mid-sized bookshelf speakers. So they're two-way speakers. They have 25mm silk dome tweeters and a 16 centimeter mid-range bass driver. And if we compare them here against my KEF LS50s and my Klipsch RP600M Mark IIs, you can see they're comparable in size. They're a touch bigger than the LS50s, a touch smaller than the Klipsch. But I'd say just in terms of the amount of sound they output, I would consider them to be mid-range. All three of these speakers put out about the same amount of sound. So it's probably a touch big for, a desktop near-field system, but it works great in a listening room like this, which is about 12 by 15 feet. So in the first half of the video, we'll be comparing the BR03s to the aforementioned KEF and Klipsch speakers using my solid-state system. So that would be my Saga preamp and my Vidar power amp. And then for all digital sources, we'll be using my Chord Mojo 2 as the DAC. And then for vinyl, we'll be using my U-Turn Orbit with an Ortofon 2M red cartridge, and then my Projects Phonobox DC Phono preamplifier. And then a little later in the video, we'll also talk about using the BR03s with my tube amp here, which is a Rizong A10 integrated tube amp. So I used the BR03s as my main speakers in my solid-state system for a couple of months. And then more recently, I've been doing some A-B comparisons with these other speakers. So let's talk about the differences in a few different categories. So I'll start out with soundstage. So the LS50s definitely have the deepest soundstage, and Klipsch has the widest, but the Triangles have a nice balanced one that's about halfway between the other two speakers in both axes, so it's probably the most well-balanced soundstage. And it's large enough that it's very enjoyable to listen to, so it's one of the strengths of these speakers. Now in terms of imaging, the LS50s are the most precise. So for recordings that have very exact placement of instruments within the soundstage, the LS50s are able to laser focus on where those instruments are. And the Triangles are similar to the Klipsch in that generally where they are. They image well, but it's not laser sharp like it is with the LS50s. One other category is jump factor, so how live sounding the speakers are, and do they make you want to tap your toes if you're listening to dance music or electronic music. I'd say in that category, the Triangles are similar to the LS50s. They're perfectly fine, but the Klipsch RP600M Mark IIs definitely excel in that area for the jump factor. And then for resolution, the LS50s are definitely the most resolving of these speakers throughout the tonal range, so bass, mid-range, and treble. But the Triangles are quite good, again, similar to the Klipsch. I'd say the Triangles don't go as low in the bass as these other two speakers, but the bass that they do retrieve is perfectly good. It's actually pretty tight and natural sounding. I'd say that it goes deep enough for me to enjoy any recordings. If you're a real bass head, you might want to pair these with a subwoofer. And then in terms of low volume performance, that's one area where the Triangles are not quite as good as the other two. You really do need to turn the volume up on these to get the best out of them. Whereas I feel like the LS50s and especially the Klipsch, you can listen at a low volume and you don't feel the need to turn up to get everything from the speakers. And then one last category is just in terms of how forgiving these speakers are for less than perfect recordings that have too much compression or maybe some harshness or some distortion that isn't of the good kind. I'd say that the Triangles are very good at being forgiving with those kinds of recordings. Again, similar to the Klipsch, whereas the LS50s are definitely more analytical speakers, so they're not very forgiving of less than perfect recordings. So where do the triangles really shine? I would say that their forte is in the mid-range. So they have a great mid-range tone. And what that does is it makes for a really good emotional connection with the music, especially for music with female vocals or jazz with horns. Anything in the mid-range that really evokes emotions, these speakers do a really good job of that and really stand out in that area. So let's talk about some specific recordings that I listened to using the BR03s. So I know we talk about Diva a lot on this channel. It's one of my favorite movies and soundtracks of all time. But this was really a perfect example of the emotional connection I was talking about. So on the opening operatic track, the vocals were just so amazing sounding that really I literally got goosebumps. Is something that I sometimes get listening to this recording, but every single time I listened with the BR03s, I was getting that connection, which was really amazing. Now this is a good recording. It's not a great recording, but I feel like the triangle brought out the best in the vocals, but also the best in the recording in general. It didn't emphasize its flaws, and it sort of did emphasize some of the good parts of the recording. So overall, yeah, I listened to this several times. I really enjoyed it, and it was a great example of the kind of music that works really well with the triangles. So another recording I really enjoyed listening to was Coup d'Etat by Kip Hanrahan. So this recording, I believe it's from the early 80s, and it's a really great sounding recording. It's sort of jazzy music with kind of low-key vocals, lots of percussive instruments, and it sounds really amazing. So while the LS50s were able to get the most air out of this recording and really retrieve some of those tiny micro details, the BR03s did really well. We didn't lose much air, we didn't lose much detail, but what they did bring to the fore were the horns, the jazz horns. The tone was just so good that they really engaged me much more than they ever had listening to this recording before. Now, it's not quite as live sounding, again, as it was with the Klipsch, which makes it seem a little bit more like you're listening to a live recording, but I'd gladly hand off a little bit of that jump factor just to get those really nice sounding horns, and then overall it just sounds very balanced and good. So this is another example of a recording that I really liked with the BR03s better than the other two speakers. So another recording I really enjoyed was Traveler by the Waverly Consort. Now this recording is a little bit challenged, but not in the way that we usually talk about when something has too much compression or maybe some unpleasant distortion. This is actually a good recording, but it just sounds like it was recorded in a live venue with the mics a little too far away from the performers, and so it sounds a little distant. And I feel like the Triangle BR03s were really able to pull out the richness and body of the voices, particularly the female voices in the chorus, in a way that just sounded really good. And I felt like the instruments sounded good as well. Now we do have to turn the volume up. I generally had the volume high when I was testing all of these speakers just to compare like against like, but then the triangles really do need a little more volume to get the most out of them. But yeah, by far this particular recording sounded best on the BR03s, and again, it's that mid-range beauty, and it has a rich sound, but it's not like a syrupy tubey sound. It's just kind of a beautiful, rich, full-bodied mid-range sound that really brought out the best in this particular recording. So another recording that sounded really good was this recently remastered release of Slint's Tweez album. Now, I've had the original copy of this on vinyl since it first came out back in '89. I just happened upon a copy in the Tower Records in Piccadilly Circus in London when I was spending the summer there, and I always really liked this recording, but this remaster really brings it up a bit, especially in the drums and some of the separation of instruments. So that's really nice to hear. Now, this particular recording sounded amazing on the BR03s, and I think a lot of that just has to do with that mid-range tonality, really the really lush distortion on these guitars. Now this was really mind-blowing back in the day. You know, we've gotten used to crazy guitar distortion sounds. I mean, I can use my guitar pedal board to recreate a lot of the sounds in this recording, but back then it was really something unusual. I think they were using, rack-mounted effects, the size of a refrigerator to get some of these sounds back then, so it was mind-blowing at the time. But, that lushness of sound really played well with these. I feel it did better with these than the other speakers. With the LS50s, there is still a little bit of harshness, kind of grating distortion sounds in some places on this recording that the LS50s was pulling out, and it didn't detract from my enjoyment for listening to it all the way through, but I think on repeated listenings that those wouldn't be the speakers I'd pick. The clips did really well with this recording, and that wide soundstage really helped because there is separation of instruments in the recording, but it's a little bit crammed together, so pulling them apart really helped. But I feel that the triangles kind of in the middle there, that medium width in the soundstage did just fine, and it was the most enjoyable listening to it with the BR03. So I really like that, and I say that was a bit of a surprise. So one last recording I'll mention is the Bach Trios by Yo-Yo Ma, Chris Thiel, and Edgar Meyer. This is a really great sounding recording, and it sounded amazing with the BR03s. It also sounded great with the other speakers, and with the LS50s we did get a little bit more of that air. We got that super precise imaging and a tiny bit more detail, but I'd say that the BR03s made up for that with just that really engaging mid-range tonality that really draws you into the music. And when you're listening to it, you don't feel like you're missing anything. You can tell that there's a little less air and detail than we were getting before, but it doesn't detract from the music at all. And what you get from the mid-range really adds to it. So that sounded really, really good. This is one of my favorite things I listened to with these speakers. Now, everything I've talked to up to now has been listening with the solid-state system. I did listen to all these same recordings with my tube amp, and they all sounded great as well, especially this recording, the Bach Trios, and the operatic pieces in Diva just sounded amazing. Everything else sounded just as good as it did with the solid state, with the possible exception of Tweez. There's that really sort of rock drum sound that's in that wasn't quite as good with the tube amp. It was a little more loosey-goosey, but it was still quite good. But I'd say that's the only recording of those where I preferred it a little bit with the solid state using the BR03s. But in general, I'd say I would highly recommend the triangles, especially if you have a solid state setup similar to what I do with a Saga and a Vidar power amp. I think it's got great synergy, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you're into that sort of mid-range sound. If you're really into vocal music, I think that it's a great pairing. Now, I'm going to keep all of the other speakers. The LS50s are really my reference speakers. I feel like they are like a microscope into the electronics. They really give you what's happening in electronics. So they're great to have around for reviews. And also they're really good with, I don't have a ton of true audiophile recordings, but with a lot of those, the LS50s are great because they're retrieving all of that information, which can be really cool. And I'd say the BR03s are not as resolving, but they're really good in that area as well. Similarly, I'm going to keep the clips, I think, for a lot of live music and just things where you want that jump factor and energy. They work well. And I will say that with the tube amp, everything that we mentioned here sounded great, but there were a lot of things, especially some rock music, some electronic music, that sounded just a little bit flat with the BR03s and the tube amp. And those are the kinds of things that sounded great with the clips. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend the BR03s as the only pair of speakers if you have a Rysong A10 integrated, but they certainly work amazing with certain types of recordings. I think, though, that on that amplifier, I think the Klipsch RP600M Mark IIs are a little bit more versatile. But again, I think that they work great, and I'd say that if you have a Vidar and you really like the kind of music that we've been talking about here, I think that would be a great match. So I really like these BR03s. I'm going to keep them around. They're going to be one of the regular rotation speakers. That's one of the nice things about having bookshelf speakers like this. It's really easy to swap out. So if you have a particular recording, you want to see how they sound on your other speakers, you can do that without a lot of fuss. So definitely going to keep those around too. But I think that's it for this, guys. But yeah, thanks for joining us this time, and we'll see you all in the next video.